Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. In 21 BBY, the Republic Special Weapons Group developed several plans for massive superweapons that could be deployed against the Separatist Alliance. Supreme Chancellor Palpatine had created rumors that the Separatists were building their own superweapon in order to gather support and funding from Republic senators and military officials to build some type of countermeasure. In truth, Palpatine was the very source of the rumors, as his apprentice Darth Tyrannus had received the plans for an ultimate weapon from Geonosian leader Archduke Poggle the Lesser on the eve of the Battle of Geonosis. After the battle, Darth Tyrannus went directly to Coruscant where he met Darth Plagueis and handed him the plans. Now, Palpatine's main reason for building such a weapon was directly related to his Sith beliefs and his obsession with total dominance over the galaxy and seizing unlimited amounts of power. Palpatine wanted a weapon that didn't just destroy armies, but destroyed entire planets. But of course, Palpatine couldn't tell anyone that that was his real motive. Couldn't even tell his inner circle, who were mostly born on planets and lived on planets and had empathy for planets. And so the Republic Special Weapons Group was directed by Palpatine to come up with designs for a new weapon that could be used to break sieges, with a specific focus on planetary shields, which was a real defensive obstacle that most militaries struggled to overcome. In our own world, offensive weapons are generally far more powerful than defensive technology. The gap between offensive and defensive capabilities are always changing based on advances in technology. The introduction of automated radar-guided interception platforms like the Patriot missile system, layered with other radar-guided interception platforms like the Phalanx Sea-Wiz, creates a defensive system that makes it extremely difficult for a single missile or rockets to reach their destination. Of course, such platforms can be overwhelmed by cheaper munitions or something as simple as a drone, which then leads to the even cheaper and deadlier Ukrainian drone with a stick. It's a never-ending battle, with one side building higher and higher walls and the other side building higher and higher ladders. Now, in the Star Wars galaxy, the balance between offensive capabilities and defensive capabilities are kind of more even. Deflector shields are the equalizer. You have particle shields, which are terrific for countering high-velocity projectiles, and ray shields, which focus more on deflecting energy weapons. And for the most part, these type of defenses can take a very heavy beating. This is why in Star Wars we oftentimes see large cruisers and battleships slugging it out at close ranges, something we would never see in modern naval combat here on Earth, where even the smallest strike by a missile or a torpedo could cause catastrophic damage and casualties. A deflector shield is the type of passive defense that military leaders have been dreaming of for decades, and it's greatly changed how combat occurs in Star Wars. Now, the strength of a deflector shield is directly related to a shield generator and how much power it can draw. Your typical Imperial-class Star Destroyer houses a KDY-1A2B solar ionization reactor, aka a type of fusion reactor that contains essentially a miniature star. It's reported that such a reactor outputs several thousand Yoda watts, not Yoda, but like Yota with 2 T's and an A, which means about 1 million billion watts, which is just a stupid number. It's basically unlimited energy. This is why the deflector shields on an Imperial-class Star Destroyer, get this, can withstand up to a gigaton worth of energy. That's 1 billion tons of TNT. For reference, the largest nuclear weapon detonated on Earth, the SAR bomb, was about 50 megatons. That's about 1/20th of a gigaton. And so yeah, if a Star Destroyer appeared over Earth one day and we launched all of our ICBMs at it, we might get lucky enough to remove that shield. But then again, it can regenerate pretty quickly. Now here's the thing, a Star Destroyer is massive, but deflector shields in Star Wars are scaled up to the planetary level, which is even more insane. Now we're talking about reactors so large that they really do have unlimited power potential. We've seen the Rebels use antiquated planetary shields on Atollon to withstand bombardment from Thrawn's entire 7th Fleet, and during the Battle of Hoth, the Empire don't even try to bombard the planetary shield and instead elected to carry out a ground assault through the shield. I theorize that Bail Organa was as bold as he was resisting the Empire, primarily because Alderaan had a massive planetary shield, which in theory allowed it to challenge whatever the Imperial Navy could throw at it. And so when Palpatine told his military advisors that he wanted a weapon that could crack a planetary shield open, that was a very legitimate ask. Of course, the Death Star that he would build was complete overkill for that task. The amount of devastation it wrought was far too much, and the resources it took to build was just ridiculous. ridiculous. Now, alongside the Death Star plan, the Republic Special Weapons Group was tasked with creating 2 other prototype super weapons, which would become useful when the Republic finally besieges the Separatist homeworlds. One concept was the automated battle moon asteroid, which we covered in previous videos. This massive structure, which really does look like an asteroid, uses stealth to get close to a target planet, at which point it unleashes hell with a ton of turbolasers. The second concept was a massive torpedo siege platform, which is what we'll be talking about today. Now, both of these weapons started development in 32 BBY. That's roughly when the invasion and blockade of Naboo happens. But due to the Republic's more pacifist tendencies back then, these platforms never went into full production. But when Palpatine took over the galaxy and declared the rise of his new empire, well, suddenly there was the political will and industrial capabilities for not only one of these super weapon programs, but multiple ones. At 1,900 meters in length, the Torpedo Sphere was nicknamed the Pocket Death Star by Rebel intelligence because of its vague resemblance to the larger super weapon. There's even an equatorial trench. But instead of utilizing a gigantic laser, the main armament on this thing is, get this, 500 proton torpedo tubes. 500. Now, proton torpedoes are not just like basic missiles, they're not like a Hellfire missile or Sidewinder. They're actually immensely powerful, with a reported yield of as high as 10 megatons. That's roughly the same yield as the largest nuclear warheads we can place on ICBM. These proton torpedoes pack far more damage than most conventional energy weapons like turbolasers, but were quite costly to manufacture. The Torpedo Sphere had thousands of dedicated energy receptors placed on the surface of its hull, which were used to scan and analyze energy emissions from a target planet's shields. The idea was to look for potential weak points in the defenses. Most planetary shields had different sectors. Some sectors were weaker than others. These technicians were also looking for power fluctuations. Most planetary defense shields could have fluctuations in power drops of as much as 20% in energy. Once the ideal firing solution and target was figured out, that was passed down to a large team of technicians who would calibrate the 500 proton torpedo launcher tubes on board. It should be noted this process took like hours of analysis, calibration, modifying things on the ship, and so this wasn't really a ship that you kind of used in combat. You only brought the Torpedo Sphere out once the planet was pacified and you had control of orbit. Another very important job for the analysts was to find the location of the planet's shield generator. This could be done by studying energy emissions on the planet and trying to trace it back to where all the power comes from. Or if need be, a special forces team could be inserted on the ground. Once all the calculations were made, the Torpedo Sphere could fire all 500 proton torpedoes at the same time, usually targeting an area of the shield no larger than 6 square meters. If done properly, the planetary shield will be overloaded and it will go down for a few microseconds. At which point, 10 turbolaser batteries on the Torpedo Sphere, which were all pre-sighted to strike the planetary shield generator, would fire, ideally destroying the entire defense system and bringing down the planetary shield. This is why it's very important to hide your planetary shield generator. Most people should not know where it is. If anything, you can even build decoys that have large energy signatures that might distract your enemy. The Torpedo Sphere required a massive crew to operate, over 63,000 people, including 2,030 dedicated gunners. The main bridge of the ship had a massive viewport, giving officers a clear view of the target, just like on the Death Star. On board, you had around 120 DER targeting control rooms. This is where the dedicated energy receptors were calibrated and used to find weak spots in an enemy planetary shield. These rooms were then connected to the actual torpedo launch system and control room, and this is where they coordinate and would establish targets. The vessel also had a capacity of around 3.8 million metric tons, which meant that the Torpedo Sphere could carry multiple rounds of ammunition for all 500 proton torpedo launchers. Oftentimes, the first attack by a Torpedo Sphere was unsuccessful or partially successful, and follow-up strikes were needed. The Torpedo Sphere also had about a dozen hangar bays, which were all located in the equatorial trench on the Torpedo Sphere. Each hangar had a large 60-meter opening that allowed multiple shuttles and cargo vessels to land and offload supplies. Generally, ships of this size had problems with docking at most orbital stations. You have very few shipyards that could comfortably accommodate a ship of this size and shape, and so usually during a resupply, smaller ships were used to ferry equipment from ports or from planetside. The ship could also carry up to 9,000 additional passengers, usually in the form of stormtroopers and Imperial Navy troopers for additional onboard security. You had around 20 security stations scattered all across the ship. These were self-contained barracks with, sanitation systems and all that kind of good stuff. Each security station controlled a sector of the ship, and regular patrols were done with security personnel that were stationed there. Some security stations even had ISB liaison officers. Large ships, especially specialized superweapons like this, are always susceptible to infiltrators and saboteurs who can sneak on board of a ship, and this is why you have such a large security contingent on board. Especially because the Torpedo Sphere was just way too powerful to challenge directly in space and encourage more indirect methods of attack. And finally, as a last resort, a Torpedo Sphere has a 2-wave grav shock weapon on board, which is an experimental superweapon. This thing could manipulate gravity to create massive earthquakes and tsunamis on a target planet. The weapon was the result of experiments using grav waves for mineral surveying and was extremely unpredictable. This was really a last resort weapon because oftentimes a Torpedo Sphere is going to be in low orbit when it is attacking a planet, and if you destabilize the gravitational field on that planet, it could result in catastrophic maneuvers that could even lead to the Torpedo Sphere deorbiting and crashing into the planet. Now, generally, the Torpedo Spheres were deployed in twos to maximize the chance of their success. They also had small onboard complement of dropships and Lambda-class T-4A shuttles for their onboard security team. But other than Deflector Shields, the Torpedo Sphere really depends on other ships and entire escort fleet for protection, especially against those pesky rebel starfighters, which could do a ton of damage to the main torpedo assembly or the sensitive dedicated energy receptors on the surface of the ship. Now, 100 torpedo spheres were actually laid down by the Empire, but only about 6 of them actually entered service. It turns out the Rebel Alliance didn't really like sticking around to fight these ships when they appeared in system. There are only a few cases when Imperial forces actually assaulted a rebel-held planet with a planetary shield, and in most cases, the torpedo spheres never arrived on time to take part in the battle. Also, as mentioned, these torpedo spheres required large escort fleets, usually multiple Imperial-class Star Destroyers and dozens of smaller escort frigates and cruisers. By the time of the Battle of Endor, when the Empire was starting to face an increasingly bold and effective New Republic Navy, torpedo spheres were used defensively to guard the military shipyards at Corellia. 500 Proton Torpedoes and, multiple crew members on each one acquiring targets is no joke. You could literally send a wall of Proton Torpedoes at a fleet and destroy it before it even, exits hyperspace, basically. As such, these vessels were always the first target of Rebel fleet commanders. In the few documented cases where torpedo spheres engage Rebel forces, usually the Rebel commander or any enemy of the Empire will try to ram the torpedo sphere. On one occasion, Rebel forces used a massive field-secured container vessel known as the Black Ice to ram a torpedo sphere successfully. These field-secured container vessels were over 7,800 meters in length and could carry enough fuel to power an entire star fleet. It's a very explosive type of vehicle. And in Legends, Imperial Warlord Grand Admiral Joseph Grunger slammed his Super Star Destroyer Aggressor into a torpedo sphere that was annihilating his fleet. The torpedo sphere is a really interesting design. It's a sign of what, military designers can do when they put their heads together and really think outside of the box using existing technology. Of course, the Emperor was not interested in real problems and spent most of his time chasing ancient manuscripts and doing over-the-top evil nonsense. Had he focused more on platforms like the torpedo sphere and utilized them not just as a planetary shield cracker, but like a vessel for a combat fleet, I think this could have really prevented the rebellion from being successful at many battles. 500 Proton Torpedoes in the air at the same time is just not something you can contend with. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.